So this gospel reading that we read it actually not all that many weeks ago. I have a new commandment. Commandment. The Latin word there in the Latin translation of the Bible is mandatum, or in English we would say mandate, right? Or in church we say a slight twist on that, Maundy, and put the word Thursday after it, right? This is the reading that we have when we hear about the Last Supper. The disciples are gathered together. Jesus gets down on his hands and knees and washes their feet as though he is a common servant in that place, washing the feet of his disciples, and they are stunned. Now, the text, as we read it, is very short. We don't have the whole foot washing part, and we have this whole very John-like, awkward, glorify him and himself, glorify section. There's like half of it that we can just scrape off the top on some level, at least for the purpose of today's sermon. But we think of this image of love. Now, Pastor Friederike several weeks ago talked about love in her sermon on the Easter story of Jesus having breakfast on the shore of the lake with the disciples and repeatedly asking Peter, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter saying, "Lord, you know that I love you." But as Pastor Friederike mentioned, these are different Greek words for love. In English, we have the one word. In Greek, they have at least three main versions of the word love. Jesus saying, "Peter, do you agape me?" And Peter responding saying, "Lord, you know that I philos you." Philos, brotherly love. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Philos, that's where we get the name of the city. But this image of agape love is this holistic, self-sacrificing, God-like love. It is something that in many ways we as human beings are not capable of. We tend to be too curved in on our own selves to love in that agape sense of love. So what do we have in this text? I give you a new commandment that you love one another as I have loved you. Now we'll get to the Greek in just a second, but how has Jesus loved us? Particularly as we look at it very much as post-Easter people, but perhaps more importantly in this Easter season, we think of it in a post-Good Friday kind of sense. That Jesus would give his whole life for us. This sense of service and self-sacrifice that we read about during Holy Week is profound, something that we don't always live up to. This idea in the text where Jesus says, "I give you a new commandment that you love one another as I have loved you," there's only one Greek form of the word love used in this text, and it's the form of agape, this self-sacrificing, almost God-like love. I give you a new commandment that you agape one another as I have agaped you. That's it. That's all. Just that you love one another as I have loved you. So just do it like I did it. Wow. What does that mean? How am I supposed to do that? And how do I love people that I don't even like, let alone love? How does this work? In the text it says, "People will know that you are my follower because you have love for one another." Agape again. This idea that we love in a different way. Now, the text, the gospel text, is suggesting that that love is something that is expressed within the community of faith. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the idea is that amongst the disciples, that people from the outside should be able to see by the way in which they treat one another, oh, those people, they must be followers of Jesus. See how they treat one another. Now, I think as we think of this idea of love and how we treat one another, is that the sense in our society today? That people look and point at Christians and say, oh, they must follow Jesus. See how they love each other. I'm not entirely certain that's the vibe that is happening. Often, Christianity in our nation is often a group that is portrayed, rightly, wrongly, maybe as the case may be, as being a bit judgmental, a bit over and against, a bit you need to do it my way or no way. That's not exactly what the text is calling us to be about. That we love in a self-sacrificing sort of way. Now, we can look at this text strictly as the idea of how we treat one another as fellow believers, maybe as members of grace, right? Just our kind of crew, which is still a good question. Are we exercising that sense of self-sacrificial love like Jesus loved us towards one another? Are we doing that? Are we serving each other? Are we reaching out in love and grace? Now, I have to add a little footnote here. I don't think love is always universally a sense of permissiveness. We challenge one another at times, but there is this sense of love and grace that Christ is about, even when it's hard. Now, when we look at the first reading and add to this a writing that comes later in some ways, we hear the story of Peter, which is kind of fascinating to me. Peter, as he moves from the Gospels, where he is a foot-in-mouth kind of guy, act first, think later, often stumbling, making the wrong move. He's the one disciple that Jesus turns to and says, "Get behind me, Satan." That guy. In Acts, he's kind of matured into senior churchman in some ways. And he rolls into this story where he is dealing with other believers. And in Peter's day and time, that was primarily a group of people that were starting with step number one, which was being Jewish first, and followers of Jesus second. Maybe a close second, maybe even an equal second, but that was the understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ, begins with being Jewish. And we have the text here that takes it in a different direction. We get this vision that Peter shares, this sheet coming down from heaven with all kinds of animals. And it's great. I love what Peter says. God, you know, I can't eat these. And God says, whoa, what are you calling my creation here, bad? Suddenly, the world is opened up to the non-Jewish world in a way that is different. Suddenly, these stories of love within the community suddenly are cast with a wider net. A sense that we are to act in this way, not just in our little enclaves, but universally. That we would be known by our love towards all people, not just within our own communities. Now that's hard. I think as individual people of faith, that type of love is going to be challenging in certain circumstances. And maybe we will even come up with different ideas as to what that looks like in different contexts. Certainly today, as we look at the gospel reading and this idea of service towards others, I would be remiss in not mentioning the major COVID milestone hit this week of 1 million deaths in the United States. 1 million. and a staggering number of them preventable due to vaccination. It is a sobering number. What does it mean to be people of faith who love our neighbors in the midst of an ongoing pandemic? What does that look like? There are all kinds of answers to that. But the thing that I would suggest primarily is it's something that we think about often. Not so much the first question, what is best for me, but perhaps what is best for my neighbor. We're in a cycle in our culture where we talk a lot about freedoms, not unrelated to COVID, of course. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about our responsibilities in this life. This text that we have today, this business of love towards one another, calls us to ask those kinds of questions. What kind of responsibilities do we have towards our neighbors? How might we show love towards our neighbors? As you hear this text, the last piece that I want to leave with you is the phrase that we started with. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Think of how that could have been worded differently. You know, I've given you guys an example, and I'm kind of hoping you'll follow it. Is not what the text says. The text says, I give you a new commandment. And the Latin translation, perhaps communicating the broad understanding of the Christian community related to this text, bringing it to our English word. I give you a new mandate, a word that we've grown fond of over these last 2 years, right? I give you a new mandate, that you love one another as Christ has loved you. Amen.